What we're going to do today is install a reproduction of the William Malcolm 8-power sniper scope, which was the original Marine sniper scope which they mounted on their 1903 Springfield rifles. As I understand it, and I don't recall correctly because I was aware of it later on in the game, but this is what Carlos Hathcock started his incredible run with in Vietnam. This is a reproduction. Hilux has had them made. The dimensions and everything, the scope itself is a faithful reproduction of the Malcolm. The only difference is the optics inside the lenses are much superior because they're today's lenses. Now, when you look through it, you're going to say, wow, that's not a very good scope. And it really isn't. If you're looking through today's multi-coated lenses with a 30 millimeter tube, and all the rest of that with a great big 48 or 50-inch objective lens, these things are pretty dark and not very useful. However, be that as it may, this is better than the original ones, and this is what the guys worked with. And let it be said and let it be duly noted that Carlos Hathcock was more than efficient with this rifle. Now, the problem is when you get this and go to mount it on your Springfield, there are, as they are sometimes want to say, there's stuff they didn't tell you in the instruction book. Like number one, how to put the spring on, how to get the spring on. Let me talk to you about the spring for a moment. This is like the original scopes with the original Nerdle scopes where the adjustments are not in the scope. The adjustments are actually in the mount. So if you look at it this way, you can see the points here where the adjustment knobs come through and actually support the scope. Okay? Now, the way this worked, because they didn't do a real good job or weren't entirely positive that the scopes could take the recoil of the rifle, they set these so that the scopes would actually recoil independent of the rifle. So as the rifle recoiled backwards, the scopes want to stay forward. So here's your front mount, and watch this. Rifle recoils backward, scope comes forward. You notice that? That's what that big spring does. It basically dampens it out. So as the rifle recoils back, the scopes go forward, and then it comes back into position. Now, as I understand it as well, I wasn't there in spite of what some people say, many of these people use these without the spring on it. So just with enough tension in on the various mounting screws here so that it would allow it to recoil forward, and then they just push the scope back for the next shot up against the collar. So however you choose to do this, both are correct and both work. Now, since this doesn't come with the spring mounted on it, what you need to know is, how do I get this on? Since you can't just unclamp this and take it off, nor are you going to go and unscrew the front here. What you have to do, I'll turn this around, what you'll see on this side of the ring and on this side of the ring are two screws. What these two screws do, when you take those out, it allows you to, first of all, you can go ahead and unthread the eyepiece here, and it allows you to slide this ring back off and off. But these two screws go in and hold the reticle in position. So you have to be careful when you take this off that you don't get the reticle rotating back and forth in here. These two screws, when you thread them back in there, have to thread into that reticle. So anyway, that's how you do it. You unscrew the ocular piece, you take the two screws out here, and then you slide that ring off. Then you can slide the mount off, and then you can slide the other pieces off. Now let's talk about the order that these pieces go in. What you have here in the rear is a clamping ring, and you have another clamping ring here in the front. These provide the stop. You'll also notice a rib on the top of the scope here. This is actually inlet. There's an inlet milled into the top of the scope tube here that goes in. And that locates this, and it locates these other rings here as they come back and forth so that they don't rotate. You can see there, if you look carefully, that this has a slot in that ring. So make sure that the rings are lined up that way. The rear one here has a set screw, and this set screw locks down against this rib on the top and holds this ring in place. Now, if you want to, you can leave that slightly loose and allow that to float back and forth, if you will, but I think we're better off locking this down. The other clamping force is provided by the little ring here. And now, what you'll notice, and I'll show it to you separately here, that's the screw that clamps the ring together, the one in the front and the one in the rear. That's not a big screw. Easy to strip, and you can't put too much pressure on it. While we're here, let's talk about something else while we're at it. These rings here, one side of the ring is threaded, and the other side of the ring is not. Now, if you put the screws in from the threaded side through the unthreaded side, then what you're going to do is you're going to use that nut basically as a clamp. You clamp that down, and that allows you to take it loose and put it back on. The problem with that is you can get an awful lot of force on that large knurled knob. That being said, the screws in this are fine, or the threads in that are fine, and these screw threads are fine. So you start cranking on this knob with your ham fists here, it's really easy to strip this screw. When I got the scope in the mail, that screw was stripped. If you do it the other way, where you put the screw head through the unthreaded portion and into this threaded part here, then you can use a screwdriver and you clamp it down just till it's snug on there, and you can be careful that you don't put too much pressure on it to strip it. Then the knob here simply becomes a lock. Once you've done that, you're in good shape. That's the way I'd do it. Now, you clamp the one in front, and remember that the front ring here moves back and forth. Again, you can adjust the tension by tightening this screw down here on the top. That's what puts the tension on this front ring and allows it to move back and forth without wiggling off center or doing the. You can't allow the scope to move inside this ring other than fore and aft. If it moves up and down or side to side, then you're not going to have a repeatable aiming point in the scope. So put the thin base ring here in front, you put your spring on, then you put the thicker ring in the rear with the set screw in the top, and then you slide your last clamping ring on and clamp that down here. Once that's in together, boom, it works. Or simply leave the spring and these two ring bases off the gun. All right? And then you simply return it on your own. Okay, once those are on, you go ahead, you slide the ring back on, being certain that you didn't lose the reticle in there. Don't do that. You'll not be happy if you do. Make sure everything is centered in there. Tighten the screws. Again, don't ham-handed them. They're very, very tiny screws. They're easy to lose. They're easy to strip. And then thread your focusing eyepiece back on. All right, now, once you've done that, you get to the part where they say, put the mounts on the gun. Well, if you don't have a mill, and if you haven't done this before, or you don't have a Forster jig, or any of the other things that can happen with these, that's easier said than done. It's like, to make rabbit stew, kill a rabbit. Well, if you don't have any rabbits or nowhere to get them, the rabbit stew part then is not material. You have a rear base, which is thinner, and goes on top of the receiver. Now this butts up. Let me show you the gun here. This typically is mounted so that it butts up against the sight ring here directly on the front of the receiver. Now the easiest way to start this and get square here to begin with is if you had a transfer punch, it's even easier. But in this case, we've taken the shank of a number 28 drill and pointed it. If you put it in your drill motor and spin it around and then put it up against your belt sander at a 45-degree angle, it will put a point dead center on this. All right, so you take this. Now this just exactly, well, about 2/1000 undersize fits this hole. Now if you move this back and forth across here, you'll find that we've made a line. You should be able to see that right here. Okay. At the same time, I then made another one here at the rear. Now, just to verify, you go ahead, you slap your base up on top, and you look down through and you say, yep, looks to me like those two holes are right down the center. So that gives you the place to start. Now, the front base is higher. It's going to mount right here. So there's two things that we have to do. We have to make sure that the front base here is center to center 7.20 inches. Now that's center to center. That's not screw hole to screw hole. So we're going to start to get into some mathematics there. Now, this being the front base and going on a tapered barrel, you would assume that this would be tapered as well. In other words, it would be thinner here at the rear and a little thicker here in the front, so that when the barrel is tilted this way and the taper, that this would not be, that it would be level. However, these happen to be exactly the same front to rear. So the little bit of taper that you're going to get between these two holes is apparently not enough of a difference to bother Mr. Malcolm and Company. You will also notice on this that this has a cutout on both sides. See if we can see this here. In these particular bases, what you have is as a screw comes through, it actually comes over this slot and engages that screw hole here in the side of the base. So if you were to slide the base on here and run this out, this will center in there, and you run that clamping screw in there, that then locks into the slot on the base. Now, so it doesn't make any difference with the front which way you lay this. With the rear, it does, because you'll notice that the rear only has one cutout for that screw hole. So that must go on the right side of the gun. When you mount that on the gun, it's got to go on the right side. That way your clamping screws will be in it and you'll be in business. All right, you already saw when we made these two marks across here by using our homemade transfer punch inside those screw holes. So we know pretty much where they're going to go. Now, I calculated this out from the center of the screw hole, assuming that the screw hole is 140 in diameter, plus the 80 thousandths width from the side of the screw hole up here. And by figuring that out, I came up with 150, or 140, and then we're going to come back another 10 thousandths to have clearance. So I'm just assuming that I'm going to come back off this point 150 thousandths. So actually what I'm going to do is, once I get this clamped in a vise, I'm going to put that point in the drill chuck, and I'm going to bring the point down right on this hole here, and that's exactly where I'm going to drill my first hole. It's not critical. If I have a little bit of clearance here, that's good, but a few thousandths one way or another is not going to make a difference. The important part is that the distance between here and the front base are accurate. So we'll come here, it's about 150, and we'll locate that up. What I'm going to do now is take the gun out of the stock. We'll go over and we'll put it in the mill. Now, all you need to do is take the two front bands off here. You take the two screws out that hold your trigger guard on, and the whole gun will come out. Now, you'll want to take your bolt out, and you're going to need to take the trigger off. There's a pin down there, but by the time you get involved with this, you should know how to do this and take it apart and put it back together. If you don't, J.B. Wood's book on centerfire rifles gives you the complete disassembly, reassembly, and there's bazillions of web pages out there that'll tell you how to take apart a 1903 Springfield. All right, so let me take this apart, and we'll go over and I'll show you how we're going to mount it up and cut our holes. First thing you need to do is have a mill. Now, this could be done on a drill press with a one of those mill slides in there, but when you start drilling and tapping receivers and rifle barrels and things of that nature, the precision required is such that you really do need to use a mill. So They make a Forster fixture, which also goes on those, which are pretty expensive. By the time you get around to spending $300 or $400 for one of those, you'll already know how to do this. So let's assume that you have a mill. If you have a mill, we also assume that you know how to operate it. So what we do first is, of course, we run our indicator along the side of the vise face here to make sure that it is square and we're traveling back and forth parallel so that we don't have the rifle canted in there. So it's got to be even all the way across here when you run your indicator across. Next thing we do is we'll drop the action in there. We took the pin out which held the trigger because that would hit the bottom of the vise. But other than that, we just took the bolt out and took the action out of the stock. So one pin out comes the trigger, bolts out, stock's out. When you set this down into your vise, the bottom of the receiver is square. They're parallel flat rails. So when you set that down in there and close the receiver, the top of the rail where the receiver turns around is got a cutout in there and it's got a 90 degree. So if you push this down in here and then simply tighten your mill vise up, make sure you rotate it a little bit back and forth to take all the slop out. It will automatically be centered in those jaws, and the rotation will be such that the top is the top center of the gun, which is where you're going to put your holes. Now, how do we know where to put the holes? Well, what we did was we put two number 28 drills through the holes. That's the largest that would go through here. A 29, or a 27 is too large. And then we take the amount here and measure that, which at this point is roughly 190. So you subtract the diameter of the drill. In this point, since we have just a tiny amount of slop, I'm using a figure of 140. You subtract 140 from that measurement, that will give you the center spacing on the holes. Okay, once you've done that, you're pretty much in business. Do it with both of them, and then you have your center spacing on the holes. Then what you're going to know, we have to have center-to-center distance between the rear base and the front base is given as 720. So we go ahead and we measure the length of the bases and divide that in half, and I made a pencil mark on each one of these right in the center. Now, it's not critical. All we're doing is checking to be sure we're reasonable here. So I also measured end to end by taking the pin that I made, putting it in the drill vise, in the drill chuck, and I brought it down right here on the very front edge at the rear of the sight here. Now, by doing that, I came back 160. I figured that the center of the hole was 150, but I added another 10,000 for clearance. Now, had you gone with 150 and this was a little bit too close, you could always just touch the end with a file, but it's not critical, so I figured by adding 10,000, we'll be in business, okay? So then I turned the lathe back turned the mill table back 160 thousandths, came down with my mark and made a point there so I know where I'm good. Now, from there, I came back to where I had made the center. I took the center mark that I made on the base, and then I made a mark also with a pencil here on the receiver. And from there, I went forward 7.2 inches, and I made another mark up here. Okay, so now center to center on these were 7.20. Now again, the pencil marks and the rest of these aren't critical. We just want to check and make sure that once we do our calculations and come up with the exact amount, if we set this down on here, we can say, oh yeah, okay, fine, I didn't screw up by 100 thousandths or something like that. All right. Then what I did is I made a center mark on this one as well, and I set that there. Oops. And put my little punch that I made out of that drill so that it's lined up on here, and then I gave it a tap. Now, that gives me the approximate location that this hole is going to be, and that's right here. So once I did that, then I went ahead and, knowing these two distances and knowing what the centers are on them, the center to center on the large base is 0.820. I have to divide that in half so that I know how far to come back towards the center of the piece here. So that would be 410. On the larger piece, the taller piece, the front one, they're closer together, they're 0.560. So from one hole to the center is half of that, or 0.280. All right, we take our 7.2 inches. At times I may refer to that as 720, but it's 7.2 inches. All right, and from that 7.2 inches, since I'm going to be located off the hole here, and that's how we're going to locate everything, my 0 point will be the front hole here in the front, in the rear base. That's the center point. That's where we're going to work off everything. That's my 0. Okay, so I've centered the, used my point, and I centered the drill chuck, so it's running right dead center down the middle of the receiver here, and I came back 160 thousandths, and then I zeroed that on my mill. That's my 0 point. All right, now to know where my rear hole here, which is going to be the next hole that I drill, and there's a reason for that. I want to make sure that I get everything together and we're as close to that 7.20 as we can get. To get from this point to this point, from 7.2, I need to subtract a distance from the center of the piece here to the center of the hole. Now, as I said, that's 0.41 inches. And the front base, which is narrower, the distance from the center of the base to the center of the rear hole is 0.28 inches. So we have to subtract 0.28 and 0.41. You add those together, that comes out to 6.9 or 0.690. If we subtract 0.690 from 7.20, we're going to come up with 6.51. And that's the distance from the front hole of this base to the rear hole of this base. Now, I did that. I ran it forward that amount. I set the base down there, and sure enough, it looks like the center lines all line up. And that's all we're concerned with here, okay? Now, we need to know then how deep we're going to drill these holes. What I did was I took the screws, the long screws and the long base. All right, I have the front screw now through the hole in the rear base. And I measure this, and I come up with 170 thousandths. That's how much the screw sticks down. Now, I also then measured, I took my number 31 drill, which I'm going to use to drill this base, and I measured the distance because I can't just come down 1.70 because the drill has a point on it, of course. It's not flat. So I measured this, and this appears to be about 45 thousandths from here on the side of the drill to the tip of the drill, that much distance. So I added that to that, and I added a little fudge factor, made it an even 50 thousandths. So 1.170 plus 50 thousandths is 0.220. So that's how far I'm going to drill once the drill touches here down into the receiver here. I did the same thing with the front base, and that screw stuck down 110 thousandths, and I added 50 to that, and I come up with 160 thousandths. Now, this is far more critical on the front screw than it is on the rear. You got a lot of meat in the rear of the receiver here, and it's not particularly critical. You can drill a little deeper and get down there. What we're going to have to do is kind of feel our way down here. We'll start this with a plug tap, and we'll tap down until it stops. And then what we're going to do, since I have two of them, I can afford to do this, I'm going to take that plug tap and I'm going to grind it so that it's only has one thread left on the bottom where it starts its cut. And the purpose of that is it'll be then a bottoming tap, which weren't available to me when we did this. And 648 bottoming taps don't come at the local hardware store, by the way. And we're going to go down then as far as we can go. Now, having done that on all 4 holes, if it turns out that the screws don't tighten up quite enough to pull down the base, then what I'll do is I'll shorten the screw a couple of threads. I'd rather do that than over drill into my barrel. All right? So then we'll show you how to shorten those screws and get them exactly straight. Now, if you got a mill, you know how to do it anyway, but we'll show you an easier way to do that as well, at least faster. Okay? Now, as I said, I've lined this up. I've got a number 2 center drill here. I'm going to go ahead and drill this hole. I'm going to do the entire drill and tap in one operation or in one location on the one hole, and I'll show you why in a moment. Okay? You can use Molly D. You can use whatever it is you like for a cutting fluid. All right, now what I did was run my center drill down. You always want to use a center drill because they're dead stiff and they won't wander around. You don't want to see the tip of that drill wandering around just trying to drill your hole. So always start with a center drill. Number 2 is the right size for this, and I've run that down, and I have just started the countersink here so that I know that my drill is going to be right on the money there and dead center and follow that hole down. Now we're going to go ahead and tap the hole. First thing, we'll get rid of the drill bit here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put that little point that I had made back in here, and I'll show you why. Some of you probably already know. All right, that's going to give me a center. And now I'm going to go ahead and drop the table here, so I have room to get my tap underneath there. If you look on the top of your tap handle here, you've got a hole. Well, if you locate your tap in the hole and then bring your quill down so that that centers on there, guess what? That's bound to start exactly straight and in line with the drill hole that you made, okay? So while we're tapping this in, we're going to be pulling the quill down as we go to keep this located in the hole. So for now, let's go ahead and lube this up and get started cutting these holes. Break. Now you can feel these as you go. I'm using high-speed steel as opposed to carbon. If you're not used to doing this, the advantage of using a carbon tap, they are harder and they'll cut longer. They'll also break easier because they're very, very, very hard. The advantage to that is if you break it, then you can pick the pieces out of the hole by taking yourself a center punch and giving that tap in the hole a good wrap. It will cause the tap to shatter, and then you can pick the pieces out, get a new tap, and restart it. If you break off a high-speed steel tap in there, there are other ways to get it out, but that's beyond the scope of this course, so don't do it. When you feel the tap start to bind in there, back it out, clean it off, and we'll go from there, all right? All right, got to the bottom of the hole, took the tap out, cleaned it up. Now I put the base on here in the screw hole, threaded it down as far as it would go, and it didn't quite tighten the base down. So I need to know, I know now that I need to take the threads just a little bit deeper in that hole. All right, I've shortened the tap, so we've only got a thread or so on the bottom left to cut, and we'll go ahead and run that in. Okay, and that's the bottom. So back that out. All right, taps out, clean the hole. I know I put about another 3 threads in there because that's how far I turned and I was about a thread out. So the hole's deep enough and we're going to work. Now there's no point, if you understand how to run the mill, us explaining to you and watching us drill 3 more holes and so on and so forth. But basically what you're going to do, and I'm only going to run through this to be sure we got it, as I said, the distance now that we need to go from this front hole here to the rear hole here is 6.51 inches. So once you've run down there, make sure you're centered on here. Again, don't just take it for a fact that because you checked your head back here that it is. I would go ahead and come back up to the correct distance of 651 and then center again and make sure you're dead center on here and then go ahead and drill and tap your holes. Now, to tell you about that, again, the holes there need to go in, or the screws stick down 110 thousandths, 0.110. So when you add the 45 thousandths or so to it, that's going to be 155 or so. So right in that neighborhood. Don't get careless with that. If you run too far and go into the bore, you've ruined the barrel. You're going to have to put a new barrel on, so don't do that. When we get started drilling, we'll do the rest of these holes here. We'll take it to the bench. We'll assemble it. Once we're done with that, make sure everything fits in good shape, check our marks, and then we'll be back to the mill, and we're going to mill the relief slot in the top of the forend so that it will close down over the base, and we can actually get the scope on and off. All right, so let me get started on these holes. All right, now we're going to go ahead and cut the clearance hole in the forend wood. What I did was we went ahead and mounted this, mounted up perfect, screwed it down, came back to center. Once I had the center on that, I went ahead and slid the handguard into the mount here. Doesn't make any difference that it wasn't exactly side to side, wasn't important. But then what I did was I had the point back in here, and it was centered. So with the handguard then on the gun here, I came down and made a few points, dimple points right here. So that marked my center on where I want to be on the handguard. So the piece here is just a gnat's ass under half-inch wide, and it's 840 long. So we're going to use a half-inch end mill to cut the slot. That'll give a good fit side to side, and we're going to go ahead and add 30 thousandths to each end because we need some clearance here. We're probably going to end up having to file the edges on the holes here to get it go on because it's, as you can see, this isn't a complete half-inch radius here. So we go ahead and cut this, and then we'll head to the bench. All right, well, that finishes our extra cuts, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But in the meantime, I want to show you how we managed to clamp this in and hold it tight in the vise here without cracking anything because it's fairly fragile. As you can see, this is parallel here, and it's an inch and an eighth wide. Now, if you try and clamp this here, what you're going to do is split this because it's very thin. Well, you can't clamp it tight enough without splitting it to hold this still and not have this bounce around. So if you set this in here on the parallels like that, what we did is I took and I cut a piece of about half-inch plywood here, and I cut it the same inch and an eighth wide. Now, what that means is this is going to be really hard to compress, but it will compress far enough. If I put it in here, and even that up, make sure that's slid back, tighten this up here, and you can see we're even all the way front to rear, and I can put a lot of pressure on that, and it's not going to squeeze far enough to actually crack this, but this is not going anywhere, and it can't go up or down because this is clamping it down, so it's kind of in a four-way bind here. It can't go anywhere, so that worked really well, and it's solid. Now let me take it out of here. We'll go back to the bench, and I'll show you what all these extra cuts were and why I had to make them and what the dimensions are. What we have here is the original hole that we cut that's a half-inch wide for the base, which is a few thousandths under a half-inch wide, and then we cut it 800 thousandths long, actually 850 thousandths long, but that's actually a little short because the base of the ring has to go over that, and that's almost 900 thousandths long. So in keeping with every other piece of this scope, nothing really matches. So, you line up one piece, you get it in, and then you're going to have to fudge or you're going to have to trim, and I'll explain that. So we cut this 850 thousandths long, which meant that we then had to get in here with a file and bring the edges back and over so that the more or less rectangular base fits inside here. Now, once I had that and got it on, then of course you realize that the base here isn't a ½ inch wide, of course. The base is almost 800 thousandths wide, and it's not 850 thousandths long, it's 900 thousandths long. So we got a number of issues here. The distance from here at the bottom of the base to the top of the slot which corresponds with the distance from the top of the sight base here to the top of the, or actually the bottom of the slot on the rifle, is about 190 thousandths. So we'll assume 200 thousandths to have some clearance and some operating room. So this is what I did and why. All right, after I put this on for the first time and saw where it was going to sit, and saw the fact that, of course, the forend here isn't exactly perfectly aligned right to left with the center of the barrel. What a surprise that was. But in any event, after I did that and made the other corrections on it, I went ahead and took the Gunsmith's Lifesaver, some Acroglass gel, and I put that in around here and colored it dark brown so you wouldn't normally see that. When I get done, I'm going to go back and put some more here on the side over here so that it just exactly matches the width of the base here. That way, when it's on here without the scope mount on it, all you'll see is the top of the base peeking through here. Okay. Now, then what I had to do is I took a 1/4 inch end mill and I came back to the point where the side here of the forend was just even, the top of the forend was just even with the top of the base, which happened to be about halfway back. From that point, I set the end mill down 200 thousandths of an inch. I then, from the part where it just touched the side of the base there, I came over 150 thousandths of an inch. And from that point, I cut along the entire length here. I went forward and gave it an additional 20 thousandths here for clearance. And then from this point here, I came back 900 thousandths times 2, which is 180 or 1.8 inches. Now that does two things. That allows you to put the sight in here, because after all, it can't just drop over the top of that base. It has to slide on. So it has to come back in, same height that the base is, and at that point you slide it forward and lock it down. Now, that's the reason that I came back from here to here and made a length of slot of 1.8 inches long. So we're 0.8 or 800 thousandths wide, we're 1.8 inches front to rear, and we're down from a center line here of the base, we're down 200 thousandths. So this is all flat and it comes down. Now we have one other little issue. On the side of the base of the scope is you have your clamp. Now that's not even with the top, so you have to relieve for that. So what I did is I took that same 1/4 inch end mill and I turned this up on its side. Actually, it was the other way around, but you couldn't see it that way. And I brought the 1/4 inch end mill in to the same 200 thousandths that I had here. I could have had it slightly higher, but I saw no reason to leave a step. So I just brought it down to here, gave enough room, brought it forward and back, and that nicely rounded it up and down on the way back. So once we're all done with this, because this isn't a video on staining and coloring, I'm going to take some walnut stain and I'll stain the wood here, and we'll put some oil finish on here to make it look factory like the rest of this here, so the whole thing will look roughly like it does on the rifle here. So show how this goes here. Slide the ring back and the fore-end and bayonet. And so you'll see it right here. This is the part exactly where it was even with the top at first and when we plunge cut. And if you look at this from the side, you can see that the front of the base is a little bit above the top line of the stock, and obviously the rear of the base is below. So if I can hold this here for a moment. Back that screw out. And there we go. That's how it mounts. And if the rear mount is in place, that's exactly the way it's going to look on the gun. And we'll tighten down the screws, and away we go. Now, one other thing. You'll notice, and I didn't notice at the time, but what they said in the instructions was that the front base should go against the rear of the rear sight assembly on the rifle. Well, that would be marvelous, except that if we look here, we'll see that we have almost 1/8 of an inch that the top or the bottom of the ring is longer than the base. So if we do that, let me tighten this here for just a second. What's happening then is that the little screw catch here does not line up. Let me reverse this so you can see it. The base has this little cutout here where the clamping action of the screw over here comes in and locks it so it can't move forward and aft. Now it can't do that when the front of this is butting into the rear sight base here. So you really only have one choice. You take about 60 thousandths off the front of the base here, and you can either do that in a mill, but it would be easier, I think, just to do it with a file. But you're going to have to take it off the scope, which means, again, you're going to have to unscrew the ocular here, and then you're going to have to take the reticle ring off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's just no two ways around it. Now, what you may want to do is set the base 60 thousandths back, in spite of what they show you, or you may want to set it up here for strength, and then while you have this off, go ahead and mill off the front and the vise. That's probably I would like that best, because that way the front of the base is against the rear sight base here of the rifle, and the front part of the ring would be against that as well. So it would lock the whole thing in position. Probably the way I'd go at it. And the easiest way to do that, of course, is while they're both off the gun, go ahead and clamp this into the base so that it's where it's supposed to be, and then just file off the front or mill off the front of the base here until it's even with the base here, and that would be the way to go. All right, now that being said, let's talk about a couple of other things. One more potential problem is having this screw, rear base screw here, be slightly long so that it actually extends down into the bolt lug recess. Now that happens with some fair regularity, but you'll get used, you can feel for them, and after a while you can feel pretty much how long they are. But if you don't know in the beginning how long it is, you go ahead and you start to close this, and it's banging against the screw. So you go ahead and back the screw out a couple of turns, close the bolt down a little bit farther, and turn the screw down. All right, boom, you feel it stop there, and if you move the bolt back and forth, you can feel the bottom end of the screw there, bottom end of the shaft of the screw, binding against that lug. So that's okay. Go ahead, close it up, and then drive the screw the rest of the way in. Now on mine here, it was only had to go down about 1/4 of a turn, which is about 12 thousandths of an inch, not a huge amount. But on some cases it may be 2. But as long as it's less than a full turn, or a full turn or less, you'll just take off one thread. And the best way to do that cordless hand drill and simply chuck the head of the screw into that hand drill, tighten it up as tight as you can, and then turn it on. This should run now and spin just like a drill. Look, dead steady. You don't want to see any wobble. If you've got any wobble, straighten it up so it's not wobbling. Make sure it's in there. Kind of slowly tighten it as you move the screw back and forth, and it'll gradually center that. Now, put that on high speed, then go up to your belt sander and come straight in and just kiss it. That's about all you have to do. I mean, this is not scientific. That's going to take off about 60 thousandths on a small screw. Then what you want to do is you want to turn it slightly at an angle. When I say slight, it could be 30, 35, doesn't make any difference. And while everything is still running, you just touch that against the belt again. Now what that does is put a bevel around the outside, and these things will thread right back in just as slick as the day they came out of the factory, and everything is dead straight and square. It's a good little tip. If you haven't done it before, it's the way to go. So, all right, we're fitted here. We're ready to go. Everything is on. And so we'll pretend it's not my scope, so I'm not going to cut the front of the base off of this one. But look at it here. Mounts on here. Forward here. Bang, 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 tighten the clamps. And it's ready to go. And our Malcolm with its gun recoil scope stays in position setup is ready to go. Now in the old days, the snipers would actually leave the spring off, the gun would recoil back, and they would simply reach up and pull the scope back. Now I don't know whether that was because the spring was causing more problems than it solved by having it slam back and forth, but that's it. You change your tension on the spring again by loosening these screws here and bringing this part forward. That puts more tension on the spring, and it will allow it to go back. Now, this also gives you a little bit of adjustment on the tension here. Actually tighten that down. And that's how it works. But to review a couple of things here, keep in mind, again, these are very tiny screws, and you got a lot of leverage on this big knob here. So it's very easy if you're putting the screw through here, we're using this part which is threaded and the screw through this part which is not threaded, and then using this big knob to clamp, you're going to strip these out almost every time. And when I got this gun, one of them was already stripped out. The best way to do this is to put the screw through the side that does not have any threads in it, thread it down here, and tighten up the screw. Now that uses this small steel here as a clamp. You can feel it, you can get it tight, it's not moving, you see it's not going anywhere, and then simply use the large thumb nuts here for a lock nut, and that'll keep it from moving out. Okay? If you're going to take the spring off, or you're going to do any of that again, I'll go back in and mention it again. You're going to have to take the screws out on both sides that hold your reticle ring here. You're going to have to take the ocular piece off. You're going to have to loosen all this stuff up here, and everything's going to have to slide off the end of the scope, and it's going to be time consuming. Be careful with your reticle. Don't let it go sliding up and down the tube, or you're going to have an issue. So be very, very careful when you do all of these things. Get everything tightened up as you get it all put back together, and you'll be in business. This is one of those projects where the instruction sheet does not give you a clue in what direction to go. The only thing that you really know is that from the center of the base here to the center of the base here, it's supposed to be 7.2 inches. After that, you look and do some head scratching. It did not occur to me initially, as it usually doesn't when you're doing these projects. There's always stuff that you figure out as you go. Oh man, why didn't I think of that? But we've saved you a great deal of that trouble by going ahead and doing this ourselves and running into all the problems and solving them, so you can see them here. Now, that being said, please, just because I said it's on this one, it's 1.8 inches front to rear, and I use 0.8 side to side for the relief slot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the spacing I gave you on the holes on the bases and the lengths of the bases and all these various things, all of that's subject to change. don't ever take it as an absolute. Measure the bases of the rings, make sure that they're what I said they were, and then measure your bases themselves, make sure they're what I said. Measure the screw holes and make sure they're what I said they were. That's what they were on mine. There's no guarantee that it will be on yours. And again, once you get here and you start cutting this wood out of the way, it's almost inevitable that you're going to have to make some minor fittings. So, get yourself a sharp X-Acto knife and a couple of miniature files, round files, etc., so that you can go in and do that. And a couple of sharp stock-making chisels wouldn't hurt either. So, in any event, there you go. Once you're there, watch the thing, watch what I do, measure, 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 write it down, check the things you wrote down, make sure the addition works, make sure the subtraction works, measure, 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 get it mounted up in your mill, make a little tiny dimple with your center drill, come forward the distance you're certain that the other holes are going to be, and in each case, just make a tiny little dimple, just a tiny dimple that'll disappear with cold blue if you have to. Then measure, measure, measure. Measure these things over and over so that you know they're in the right place. Make sure everything is centered. Once you've done all of that, then go ahead and cut your holes. That's no guarantee that you're going to get it right every time, because no gunsmith alive ever failed to drill a hole in the wrong place at least once. So try and avoid, learn from our mistakes, and that's kind of what we do here at AGI, is we look through these things and try and find all the weak spots so you can save yourself some trouble.